Welcome all, and thank you for joining today's AWRI webinar. My name is Michael Downey, and in this session we take a look at water additions to high sugar must. Before we make a start though, a couple of quick reminders for anyone that is new to AWRI webinars. If you'd like to provide a comment or ask a question, please open the Q&A section of the webinar, type in your question and click to send it through. We will be holding a dedicated Q&A at the end of Keren's presentation today, but please feel free to shoot through your questions at any stage. Also a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available to view via the AWRI's YouTube channel. For those of you that have just joined, welcome. Today's webinar takes a look at water additions to must, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Keren Bindon, a research manager here at the AWRI. An experienced educator and researcher, Keren has collaborated on studies focusing on the production of lower alcohol wine, most recently to investigate the possibility of using dilution based on the 27 changes to the Food Standards Code. Keren has a strong interest in contextualizing research to provide meaningful outcomes for industry and regularly participates in extension activities such as today's webinar. Keren, it's fantastic to have you back for another session, and if you're ready to make a start, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Michael. Well, I think we're heading towards nearly afternoon, but good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. All right, so without further ado, where we find ourselves today is that we are dealing with the effects of vintage compression, in which we're finding that due to warming, that there is a narrower window in which grapes ripen, and that can cause a lot of difficulty for harvesting decisions, pressure in the winery, and then the obvious result of having much higher Baume fruit. Now, despite that, what we do see is that if we look at the actual trend in wine alcohol within Australia from 1988 through to 2014 with the data that we have, what we saw was really an upward trend up until about 2005, and this was for both, for all grape varieties. And then since 2005 till 2014, what we've started to see is that there's a general decline in wine alcohol. And the result of this might be that despite the obvious effects of vintage compression, is that there's actually been the availability of adjustment techniques to reduce wine alcohol, and that might be the reason for that observed trend. So we still find ourselves in the situation where we do need to manage wine alcohol, and so there's various techniques available to us. The obvious ones, as I've just alluded to, are physicochemical methods like reverse osmosis. But what we've also done in historical research at the AWRI is to look for new yeast strains that actually produce lower alcohol. But although these strains could be identified, and there is really only a small gain or in other components other than alcohol using these strains, so we still needed to look further afield. We've also done a bit of work on looking at viticultural methods like leaf removal or the application of hormones to delay ripening. And then obviously just looking at the effects of early harvest. So what we'll be talking about a lot today is the idea that there are gains in phenolic ripeness, in grape quality through delaying harvest. But are these real? And so we looked at really, can you just harvest earlier and get away with it? But where we find ourselves today, and the reason for this seminar, is that due to this observed effect of vintage compression, there was an approval by FSANS to actually allow the addition of water to must, but to a minimum, and it has to be done at 2 must before fermentation and to a minimum of 13.5 Baume. But this was done in recognition that it's due to the difficulty in controlling fermentation or stuck fermentations. And so the goal of this legislation is to allow for those fermentations to progress better, not necessarily to deal with the other end of the story, which is that higher alcohol. So where we want to actually start the story today is to understand, well, why do we allow grapes to ripen longer, and should we? So just looking here at this trend, we can see that for a particular example of Shiraz, you can see that the total soluble solids, or Baume, will increase as the grapes ripen. And that in particular for varieties like Shiraz, you will see a gradual decline of berry weight. The graph at the top on the right there shows the sugar per berry. So this indicates that the grapevine is actually translocating sugar into the berry itself. And what has been observed multiple times is that at some point this sugar per berry will plateau. And what that indicates is that there's no longer sugar loading or translocation to the berry taking place. So any gains in sugar, or that increase in Brix that we see, is in fact due to a loss of berry volume. So what it means from a harvesting standpoint is that one wants to maximize yield and sugar. And to really extend beyond that point, one has to have a strong justification, apart from the logistics of harvesting, why one would want to allow the grapes to basically have extended hang time or to sit on the grapevine longer. So some work which was done by Paul Petrie and his team here while he was at AWRI was to try and look at a metadata analysis of multiple studies which were done on Cabernet and Shiraz, and to try and understand, well, what is the maximum sugar at which we will see that that plateau will occur. And so from this metadata analysis, it was found that you could identify for Shiraz that this nexus essentially will not occur at a higher Baume than 13 for Shiraz, and for Cabernet it was slightly higher at 14.5. And so justification for going beyond this point, when there will be an obvious decline of yield and further potential losses from quality from that standpoint, one would then need to justify quite strongly why one would want to extend that hang time beyond that point. So what we want to consider here is, with that extension of fruit maturity, are there realistic changes in phenolics and flavour profile in these varieties that will justify that delay? So if we just look at a theoretical change in the grape berry size over ripening, at the point when the commercial harvest is reached, that berry may have plateaued in its size, it may still be increasing in size, or it may have entered a shrivel phase. But what we want to talk about here is the justification for extending hang time. So what we would expect to see is that the concentration of colour, tannin, or volatile precursors to important aroma compounds, which will end up in the wine, will actually be changing over the course of that ripening period. So when we talk about wine relevant changes, so important things like colour, for example, when we express that data as concentration milligrams per gram of the grape, that really is what is important when it translates into what it gets into the wine. But when they're talking about this change over time, the changes per berry, which we refer to as content, excludes the weight, and they may, if it's actually changing realistically and not just as a result of shrivel, then the content will also be changing over time. So a true accumulation or decline in, for example, color or flavor precursors will occur as a change in the content in the fruit. So for example, like methoxypyrazine in Cabernet, one might want to see that decreasing in one's wine. So these can increase or decrease even after the sugar accumulation has ceased. So we want to understand that we are seeing a genuine change in the flavor profile or the phenolic profile of the grape over time. So in terms of harvesting decisions, it's important that the changes in these wine-relevant components are balanced against the yield or loss or sugar increase. So that's just a bit of an introduction to where we're going to be going today in order to justify some of these decisions and make the decision around water addition. So some work which was done by Professor Delois, who has spent time at INRA in Montpellier and South Africa at Stellenbosch and at Wagga Wagga here in Australia, and is now back in France, has developed some models for how the flavour profile of Shiraz, Cabernet and other varieties changes over time. And so the top little curve there is showing you that sugar per berry. And theoretically, and it's been confirmed with data in more recent years, there is that plateau which occurs in the sugar per berry, and after that point, there are significant changes in the flavor profile of the fruit over time, which eventuates in the wine. So for Shiraz, you can see there at the point of that plateau, one will be having a fresh fruit phase, an early decline in the vegetal characteristics, which are extended longer in Cabernet Sauvignon. And then after a certain number of days, one will enter the mature fruit phase. And with Shiraz, there's that very, very quick point at which it extends into an overripe or jammy attribute. For Cabernet, there's a slightly longer phase during which the fruit profile will change. And we'll be showing you some of this kind of data today. But we will see a longer phase of vegetal with Cabernet, and then a fresh fruit and a mature fruit phase, which from our terms, we would talk about red fruit or dark fruit. And I put a question mark there because some of the data we will see today show that for Cabernet Sauvignon, there is the potential for an overripe or jammy phase to also eventuate when the fruit is very, very ripe. So we'll talk a bit more about that later on. The main point of showing this is that one wants to justify leaving the grapes hanging longer, having those gains in bricks, but to actually capture the fruit profile for the wine that one desires. So another reason for leaving grapes on the vine longer is to develop phenolic ripeness. And this, for want of a better group of compounds, we talk really about tannin and anthocyanin being important for the development of red wine color and texture. And what we find is that from various studies done, the total grape tannin, that is the milligrams per gram, as I've discussed earlier, generally stays constant through ripening, but anthocyanin increases after veraison. What we found in recent years, and that's that graph on the right there, is that extractable grape tannin, that's the amount that's actually readily removed from the grape and is important for what we understand gets into the wine, actually increases during ripening. So we see that as one extends ripeness, in this case, we're looking at 13 Baume on that graph through to actually 18 Baume for that last harvest. You can see that there's a relationship there between extractable tannin and wine tannin. And this also correlates with the development of the wine color density and tannin concentration quite well. So we see that for Shiraz and Cabernet, we want to understand the difference between these two varieties. There's a similar response for both. And so to justify extending that hang time, we can see that delaying harvest can see gains in color and tannin. But it's a combination of both the changes in content, so actually accumulation in the berry, but also to do with shrivels. So we do see clear effects that if a grape enters the shrivel phase, that part of the reason for that increase in tannin and anthocyanin is just simply because the grape has lost volume. So moving on to what we decided to do at the Institute. So I'll be talking today about work which was done both at the Institute here in the University of Adelaide. So it's really a compilation of a number of studies which were done both before and after the Fazan's regulations were agreed upon. And so we decided to really focus on understanding should we justify leaving the grapes longer? So looking at earlier harvest as opposed to later harvest, and then taking those different harvest points, most cases the latest harvest, and then applying water. So two approaches have been used. First, where we simply add water at the winery point, at the point of crushing. And this would really be more likely what is done in the industry. It's much simpler and more straightforward. But then we also took the approach of looking at a runoff, or what would typically be a saignée in rosé production, and then replacing it with an equivalent quantity of water. This, in other words, would not change the volume of juice to the solids. So one could then theoretically say that you wouldn't have changes in the extraction of important compounds that would be in the skins of reds, for example. We would then have just fermented out the grapes of the same batch of fruit as the control. So key questions that we wanted to ask through this process was, do grape varieties have different responses to water addition? So really focusing here on Cabernet and Shiraz, as I've also just introduced earlier. And I've said this a number of times now, but to ask the question, are there really gains in wine quality by harvesting later, which justifies the use of water addition? Then, very importantly, does the quantity of water affect wine outcomes? So looking at that lowest level of 13.5 Baume, some of the studies we've we're looking at were done slightly before the Vezan's regulation, so we went to slightly lower levels of Baume, but it still asked the question, how much water can we really add and get away with it? Finally, an important question we needed to ask was, does the method of water addition affect wine outcomes? So I've mentioned the runoff and replace approach or the direct addition. So can we just simply add water directly to the must? So an important starting point here is how we actually make those calculations for the water additions. So we made use of our own calculator here at the AWRI, so I've just provided a link there for anyone that is not aware of it. And the key in this, and I think we found we had a few glitches where we didn't quite get the calculations right, it's understanding that extraction rate. So I think also coming back to the point of vintage compression and perhaps seeing later harvests and a bit more dehydration in the grapes. We're finding that now, looking at the 10-year average for both white and red grapes, that looking also across warm and cool regions, that the extraction rate is averaging now at about 720 litres per tonne, whereas historically this would have been thought to be 800 litres for reds and 600 litres for whites. In some of our work, we looked at much lower extraction rates because we have a very, well, not as effective pressing in our experimental winery. So in some cases, we didn't quite meet the target alcohols that we were expecting to. But these water addition calculators at the AWRI are very simple and easy to use, but it's that extraction rate that one needs to know. And the more accurate that is, the more accurately one can meet those target Baumes and final alcohols. So moving on to actually look at the water addition trials, so Cabernet Sauvignon versus Shiraz, we first want to ask the question, do different varieties respond differently to water addition? So for the first part of the study, we were only looking at the replacement technique, so running off and then replacing with water. And I've drawn together a number of different studies, and these are looking at different vineyards and different seasons, and also different ripeness levels of the grapes. So in this case, we're looking at levels of substitution from 6% to 20%, and grapes from 18 Baume down to only 14 Baume. So the lowest that the grapes were diluted, or that the must was diluted to, was 12.7 Baume. So slightly below what is legally allowed, but still allowing us to approach some of these questions. So looking firstly at Phenolics and Cabernet, it was found that when this runoff and replace addition approach was followed, that colour and polymeric pigment in the wines was very constant and the grapes were very, very ripe. And that was for a study done on 18 Baume fruit. It was very interesting to find that for less ripe grapes at 14.5 Baume, that colour and polymeric pigment in fact increased after the water addition, which was quite surprising here. For Shiraz, we found that the opposite occurred. Colour and polymeric pigment always decreased when water additions were made. And we looked at various ways of reasoning why this might happen, and that kind of work is still ongoing. Tannin in Cabernet Sauvignon was also found to stay constant with water addition and did not increase when the grapes were less ripe. And for Shiraz, it was found that tannin decreased when the grapes were very ripe. And this was in response to different levels of water addition as well. But it was found that tannin was constant when the grapes were less ripe. So for a study done on 14.5 Baume fruits, it was found that tannin concentration did not change when this substitution approach was followed. Now, in the Cabernet trials, it was found that the quantity of water, so how far you actually substitute with water, didn't affect outcomes on colour and tannin. But in Shiraz, it was found that the reduction in colour, which was affected more strongly than tannin, as I've said, it was greater as water addition increased. So there's probably a limit on how far one would want to go with water addition in Shiraz. Looking at the actual flavour profile of what happened in those wines, this is just the Cabernet trial, which I mentioned was done on very ripe fruit at 18 Baume. I guess I encourage you to come back and look at these slides perhaps later, because there are, just spider diagrams here, but they do clearly show the trend that one observes during ripening. So coming back to those earlier graphs I showed from Professor Delois, one can see a transition from the flavour profile through from a more vegetative character earlier on in the early harvests through to a darker fruit attribute as the grapes ripen. Just note there that there's a strong dried fruit and jam attributes for that Cabernet. I'm just going to get my mouse out here. And this is something that's not normally associated with Cabernet, but we're talking here about fruit that went through to 18 Baume. So one clearly sees here a small loss in green aroma and green flavour as the grapes ripen, but clearly those increases in dark fruit aroma and dried fruit aroma, interestingly also picking up chocolate and licorice flavours and aromas here. Now, when it comes to the water addition treatments, one can see here on the outer side that there were really very little change that was observed when water addition was made. These were all just runoff and replace treatments. And so clearly there were gains in weighting. However, one needs to also highlight that this dried fruit or jam attribute, which came across both in flavour and was much more significantly increasing in the flavour attribute here, whether that really is desirable for consumers. Importantly here, one saw a strong trend of decrease in hotness with the water addition, clearly driven by alcohol changes. And here, because that high Baume fruit may have had a bit of residual sugar, we saw a clear drop in sweetness as water additions were made. Moving on to Shiraz. This was also done with the ripest fruit that we looked at in the studies, 15.5 Baume. And clearly here, looking here at this flavour and palate graph, the strongest difference here is an increase in opacity. So as we saw that trend in tannin and colour increasing with ripening, we see an increase in the wine's opacity. And I pointed out some of those losses in phenolics that happened with water addition. Here you can see losses in opacity with water addition, but clearly higher than the earlier harvests. Delaying harvest clearly brought changes in that dark fruit flavour and aroma. And clearly we also see that there's that dried fruit attribute that starts to appear as the grapes ripen. Now, what happened with water addition is that there were notable losses also in some of the dark fruit flavour attributes and the dried fruit flavour attributes, as well as chocolate and some of the others, which you can come back to if you want to look at these slides later on. But importantly, there also decreases in hotness as the water additions were made. Irrespective of that, especially for the treatment that received the least water addition, there was clear differences from the earlier harvests, and it was really much closer to that latest harvest. So overall, changes could be said to be small, with the exception of the opacity losses and hotness. So now just looking at the two varieties side by side. So this is now both flavour and aroma attributes compiled onto two graphs. And this was done on less ripe Cabernet. So we're talking here about 14.5 Baume. And Shiraz. And here we could really see that there was that ripening trend evident with the increases in dark fruit aroma, losses in green aromas, but it was through a much smaller ripening period, so not right through to what we saw with that 18 Baume trial. It was interesting here, this was the trial which I mentioned, we saw increases in tannin and colour with the water addition. Here we can see that despite the Cabernet having those differences, there was actual drops in astringency with the water addition, which were not found for the Shiraz, where we did see that there was losses or very little change in those attributes. Sorry, these were not lost, the colour and tannin was the same in this trial. However, all that said, and please take a look at this again, the overall changes in the sensory properties were less significant than found for the previous trial in Shiraz that I've mentioned. And so really when we're looking at less ripe fruits, what could probably justify a water addition without causing strong differences in the sensory properties. So just to look at the comparison between the two varieties, some take-home messages here, we could see that both Cabernet and Shiraz show that clear ripening related trend as the grapes ripen, which, as I've mentioned before earlier, it justifies some of those benefits in delaying harvest, perhaps beyond those plateaus I mentioned. But we could see here that the water substituted wines were more similar in every case to the later harvest than those made from the earlier harvested fruit. Now, just to highlight again, we saw that increase in the dried fruit or port-like characters in both the Shiraz and the Cabernet. And so whether this is a justification for extending hang time and whether consumers actually prefer these characters, it needs to still be determined. And I think that's a very important question that one needs to ask. So for Cabernet Sauvignon, we found that runoff replace approach produced much more limited alterations in wine properties. And important decreases in hotness when water additions were made. But I think we could see that for Shiraz, there was a greater alteration of the sensory profile in riper fruit, mostly for that opacity attribute. But in all cases, we saw that there was that clear difference between the earlier harvests, and especially when the wine was substituted to a lesser extent, they were more like the control wines. Just to highlight here again, these were all treatments where we had runoff and replace, so we weren't changing the volume of solids to juice. We then want to ask the question about whether we can just simply add water, so direct addition versus the substitution approach, which would obviously be a bit more complex to do at a winery level. Now, at the points where we started this research, the main focus in Australia was looking at Shiraz, which is our biggest variety in this country. And so all the direct addition versus substitution treatments have been looked at only on Shiraz. So to ask the question, substitution or direct addition, different vineyards were looked at and over different seasons, but we could then ask again that question from less ripe or more ripe fruit, what is the effect of these two approaches? So to firstly just look at those effects on colour and tannin again. It was found that for Shiraz, that as I've mentioned before, with the substitution trials, colour and polymeric pigment was always reduced when water was added. But it was found that when the grapes were riper, there was no effect of the method of water addition. So we saw quantitative differences in colour and tannin when higher levels of water addition were made, so greater losses. But the way which the water was applied did not affect colour and tannin. When the grapes were less ripe, it was found that the juice substitution gave smaller losses in tannin, and sorry, I'm talking about colour and polymeric pigment. I'll just put the tannin results up now. Than what was seen for the more ripe fruit. So juice substitution was a better approach to follow when the grapes were less ripe. So for two completely different vineyards harvested at either 14 or 14.5 Baume and diluted 10% or 7% respectively, it was found that the smaller addition the juice substitution gave less of a loss in tannin and colour than the direct addition. So moving on to tannin, I've kind of briefly mentioned it, but these the tannin results for substitution versus direct addition were more variable. So in this case, for the riper grapes, there was no effects of the method of water addition found. And at higher levels of water addition, it was found that the losses in tannin were exacerbated. So lower tannin when more water was applied. When the grapes were less ripe, so those 14 and 14.5 Baume treatments, it was found that tannin was either unchanged or reduced due to the direct addition, but the effect was very small. So really, the less ripe the grapes are, the smaller the losses, and it's probably still something that should be applied somewhat with caution for Shiraz. This just gives you an idea of that opacity attribute that I highlighted earlier. And just to pinpoint what these different treatments are, we have our two early harvests. This is the later harvest control. So you can see that there's a clear increase in a more brown attribute as the grapes ripened and the wines were made from different harvest points. And I guess the earlier harvest is more of that rose red, paler colour. At the bottom here, we have our water addition treatment. So DA1 is a higher addition and DA2 is the lower addition. And you can see here that some of those browner attributes are present, but they actually had a more brick red character than the control. And if we look back at that earlier graph that I showed you, what we will see there is that the brownness was in fact visually evident from the sensory panel. So here I can show it to you here. So there's that change in brown color there with the water addition, so it's decreasing with that water addition. So just coming back, we've just transmitted this data earlier, but this just compares the substitution or direct addition for that higher Baume Shiraz trial. And you can really see here that what is important to highlight, and it is quite small on this graph, and I've presented this data in other formats where you can see it more clearly, but this does show a quantitative change, but I think what's important here is it's a significant change. And so what we see is that green line here is in fact the highest water direct addition treatment, and the other lines which are closer together are the runoff and replace treatment and the juice substitution treatments. And what we were seeing here is that as one moves through to higher levels of water addition and including direct addition, that there was an increase in this drain attribute, which we would really associate with a reductive off flavor or an aroma. We didn't, in fact, measure some of those low molecular weight sulfur compounds which cause these attributes, but it is possible that that is something was off with that higher level of water addition. We also saw increases in that cooked vegetable attribute, but that was for all of the different water additions. We found that, and higher as the level of water addition increased. I think that irrespective of those 2 points, one can see overall that we do see losses of the dark fruit attributes, the decreases in hotness, and those obvious changes in opacity that I showed you earlier. But overall, we do see that the flavor and aroma profiles are fairly consistent and quite close to the control. So aside from that red flag around some potentially reductive attributes developing, one can say that overall the changes were quite minor with the water addition, and that the substitution approach versus direct addition didn't make a lot of difference, with the exception of those drain attributes. Moving on to the trial which looked at less ripe fruit. So this is Shiraz grapes harvested at 14 Baume. One can see here, separating that aroma and flavor and palate, that in fact there were quite larger differences brought about by the dilution treatments here. In this case, the dilution went down to 12.7 Baume. So this was perhaps a slightly larger proportion than we talked about earlier, so it was 10%. But we can see there that for that Shiraz, that there were actually quite substantial changes, even though, as I've mentioned earlier, the changes in Phenolics was actually quite small. In this case, opacity was not looked at in the study, but we would probably justify that those changes in Phenolics would have meant that there was a very, should have been a limited change in opacity, but we did see here that there was a decrease in astringency in those wines. So quite surprising there that the effect was higher in the earlier harvested fruit than the latest trial, but noting also it's a different vineyard. So just some take-home messages from this section is that we can see that there were losses in colour and stable pigments that could occur when the higher levels of direct water addition are applied as opposed to the substitution technique. But I've mentioned that opacity was not determined on that trial in the less ripe fruit. So that remains to be determined. Overall, I think I've mentioned this before, but changes in the sensory properties overall were quite minimal when the method of water addition was compared, but we did see larger changes for the earlier harvest. So consideration, I think, as I've mentioned, needs to be given to the development of off odours with high levels of direct water addition. So I still think it should be applied with caution and perhaps prefer a smaller level of water addition, or consider the substitution approach when higher levels of water addition are needed for very high Baume fruits. So just to briefly mention some results from a trial on Chardonnay that we did. I haven't really spent a lot of time introducing white varieties, but I think it's important to the story, is just to say that we did a trial on Chardonnay in 2018. This trial also included a skin contact treatment to try and pull out whether we might see some changes in flavour and aroma with that skin contact. And in all honesty, the skin contact brought about such large changes that it kind of overwhelmed the water addition effect. So I'm just showing the data here from the simple water addition treatments. So it is clear here that we see that trend in ripening. So we again had 13.5 through to 15.5 Baume. And with that ripening effect, we saw increases in yellow color, some increases in confection, and some increases in stone fruit, as well as the obvious increase in hotness as the grapes ripened up. But it was found really that when one looked at the actual significance of these sensory differences, that they were very minor. And the only real significant attribute which changed was hotness. It is actually just worth pointing out here is that that 15.5 Baume wine diluted to 13, in fact, had lower hotness than the earliest harvest. Which we found surprising because the alcohol concentration was in fact very similar. So that's something just to be aware of in white wines, but there wasn't any real differences in viscosity, which I guess is the important attribute there from a sensory standpoint. So very simple results, but quite positive outcomes for the Chardonnay. So thank you for bearing with me through this talk. It was a lot of work to pull through data from other people's studies, and so I'd encourage you to come back and look at these slides again, just to perhaps tease apart some of these conclusions for yourself. But I think it's important just to reiterate that we saw a divergence in response between the two red varieties, with smaller effects for Cabernet than Shiraz when water addition was used, so it should still be applied with some caution for Shiraz. But also noting here that we did not do any direct addition trials with Cabernet, and so that work still needs to be done. It was found here that we showed a greater potential for phenolic loss with the riper Shiraz than for Cabernet. And Cabernet, as I've mentioned, showed very small changes in wine sensory profile with water addition, if any, using only those substitution treatments. And in less mature fruit, the changes to the sensory profile, actually, I should change that, were in fact slightly larger. We saw that slightly bigger difference in sensory change with the Shiraz fruit, even though changes in phenolics were very small. So it's still something to consider there. Again, just to flag that some off odors might be developing with high levels of water addition to direct water addition to the riper Shiraz. And so we could say there that it is probably not a silver bullet, so apply still with caution. And again, just finally to say that quite positive finding for Chardonnay is that minimal changes to wine sensory profile were found with water addition. So just to finally pull up some acknowledgements, Paul Petrie was really involved when he was here at the AWRI for initiating a lot of this work and getting the buy-in from Wine Australia to support this work. So credit goes to him and his colleagues at SARDI now. And a large team at AWRI were involved, and a lot of very careful winemaking from John Gledhill at WIC Winemaking. And I've used work which was done, some of it collaboratively with Olaf Szaleski, who was a PhD student at the University of Adelaide and is now at Lincoln University in New Zealand, and his supervisor, David Jeffrey. Also quite a large team at the Uni of Adelaide, but I've just pointed out the two names there which contributed the most to this work. So a lot of the results presented today were in fact from Olaf's PhD. So thanks for your attention, and I'd like to hand back over to Michael.
Okay, thanks very much, Keren. As Keren indicated, a lot of work went into pulling together all the results from these trials. So yes, I'm sure it's been really valuable for the audience. We're going to move from here into the Q&A. So if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask, Keren's going to stick around for a little while. Just a reminder, to ask a question, open up the Q&A part of your toolbar, type your question and send it through. So we've had a couple of questions here, Keren, around, I'll ask them both because they're both similar in nature. Are there any benefits from adding pH adjusted water? And it was pH a factor in assessing the results from water additions? And then another question about, was the water added or replaced acidified before adding to the must?
So just to answer that question, I think in the study, I've keyed out trying to understand the justification for extending hang time. And an obvious change with that is also that increase in pH and drop in acidity as the grapes ripen. And so yes, we were cognizant of that. So all of the musts, the water itself was actually pH adjusted before addition, but after addition, all of the musts were adjusted to the pH of the earliest harvest in the trial. But I do think that there's justification for adding pH adjusted water. And so the answer to that question is yes.
Okay. Are there any legal requirements for recording water additions?
I'm sorry, but I don't actually know the answer to that question. I can find out.
Yep. Perhaps send through your details there and we can follow that up post-session if you want to send through a chat message. We've also got a question here about whether you're aware of how familiar or common this practice has become in Australia since regulations were changed.
I also am not privy to that knowledge.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Any changes noticed after adding water to the ageability of the wine?
So yes, in the trial that we did, which was on that higher Baume Shiraz, we did track that through aging. And we found that, for example, we included a Saignée trial as part of that to understand, well, if you just directly run off the juice and then ferment out the wine, do you actually see gains? It was just more of an extra control there. And we found that for the Saignée treatment, there was initially increases in the phenolic profile, so tannin, color, non-bleachable pigments. And so they were a lot deeper and richer wines initially. And what we found is that through aging, those Saignée wines actually narrowed and became much more like the control. But it was found that for all the dilution treatments, there were no further losses in any color or color stability or tannin concentration. And so all the differences that I've demonstrated, which we observed from the point of the end of fermentation through malolactic fermentation, and then after an aging period, we found that they were very, very similar. So I would say that that's not as much of a consideration.
Okay. A follow-up question from earlier. When you add pH adjusted water, to what level TA do you adjust to?
I would have to talk to John, the winemaker, about that, because I just know that we adjusted the pH. I'm sorry, I have to go and look at the notes to see exactly what TA he adjusted to.
Yeah, we can follow up with you post-session about that one, Richard. Another question here. Were there any significant changes in different clones of Cabernet and Shiraz after water additions?
I would say that's an important consideration. In this case, as you can see, we did it on a very limited number of grape parcels, and they were quite large studies. So there was not opportunity to extend it to understand differences between clones. It was just to look at differences between varieties here.
Okay. And did you notice any ferment issues with water additions, either stuck, sluggish, or any noticeable YAN differences between early harvest and water adjusted ferments?
So yes, just to note there that we did also adjust for YAN. So we would have adjusted all of those ferments to the same YAN as the earliest harvest. So we didn't have any issues with stuck fermentations in this case, but I think from memory, we did look at the amino acid profiles of those wines after fermentation and found that there were some differences. For example, proline that's not fermented out by yeast was actually much lower in the water added wines. So we were interested in that. We found it actually changed the experience of sweetness in some of those wines if one just pulled out certain treatments. But so yes, there would be losses in amino acids. So if you're adding DAP, they don't have the complexity of that amino acid profile. How that directly relates to flavour and aroma development is also something that's probably a bit too deep for the level that we went to with these trials, but no issues with stuck ferments in this case.
Alison has just reposted Wine Australia's recommendations around recording water additions. So if you want to check out what Wine Australia's recommendations
Should I just read that out, or it's on the screen, but just because that answers the question earlier about the legal requirements.
Sure.
So she says here that water can be added to the must provided the Baume of the must is no lower than 13.5 at the time of addition. So 2 items to be recorded in order to ensure compliance with the Food Standards Code: the identity of each product treated with extraneous water at the must stage, and the Baume of the must at the time the water is added. They don't need an indication of how much water has been added.
Okay, thanks, Keren. I think if you've got any follow-up questions around that, then Wine Australia would be the best contact. We don't have any further questions, Keren. There's been a lot of comments about enjoying the presentation, which is great. Did you want to make any final comments before we start to wrap up?
I think just to reiterate that, you know, there's that nexus between the gains in extending hang time versus that yield loss. And so when it comes to adding water, if there's been a loss in yield, one's not necessarily going to increase the final volume of the wine. One is only going to recover that volume. So it's important to really understand that nexus between sugar accumulation versus yield loss, and to optimize both when it comes to decisions around harvesting and water addition. But thank you for your attention, and thank you for any compliments.
Okay, fantastic. Keren, can you skip through to the final slide there, which just provides some information about when our next session is. Just to start with, I'd like to thank Keren for providing some key learnings for winemakers, for any winemakers considering water additions. Thank you also to everyone that joined in and participated in today's session. For attendees, you will receive a follow-up email which will contain a link to this recording. Acknowledgements also to Wine Australia for providing funding and support for webinars via the AWRI Extension Project. Now, the next AWRI webinar is on Thursday, the 15th of October, and takes a look at Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture project, studying the differences between wine regions and the effects of provenance in Pinot Noir. If you'd like to register for this session, please visit the AWRI website. That's all we have for today. Thank you again for joining, and I look forward to seeing you at the next AWRI webinar.